Good afternoon. I'm Armando Razo. I want to thank Kathy Borner for the opportunity to share with you a new joint project with Markus Dickinson at the Department of Linguistics. And what we do in this project is we're going to show you in a few minutes, we're going to take a body of scholarly work on international development, which comes from various disciplines like political science, economics, international studies. We're going to use this corpus, this collection of scholarly work, to develop an ontology. I'll define ontology in a few minutes, but you can think of it as a conceptual dictionary to understand the diversity of networks that we see across the world. So we're going to do this in 3 stages. First, I'm going to give you a motivation for what is a non-traditional area of network science. So when I motivate this, define the scientific domain and motivate a systematic study of international development from a network analytic perspective. Along with that, I'll point to you the fact that this is not a simple task. It brings about various challenges to building a network science of international development. Then I'll give you a quick overview of the corpus and web ontology as a first response to the challenge of developing this new area of network science. Then Markus is going to come in later, and he's going to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing in terms of the underlying computational linguistics. Time permitting, maybe we'll talk about some of the machine learning algorithms that we use for this purpose. So to motivate the project, I may be biased here, but I think this project speaks to perhaps the biggest question of social science. Our weaker claim is one of the big questions of social science, in deference to my fellow social scientists here in the room. And that is, it has to do with the variable economic performance. Countries both across time, if you look at world history, there's a lot of diversity in terms of economic performance, but also across space. Let me show you an illustration at the spatial differences we can observe nowadays. This is very recent data from the World Bank. This map represents gross domestic product per capita. GDP is a measure both of productive capacity at the country level, and it's also used as a measure of national income. So GDP per capita is a proxy for average income across the world. And what you can see here, the way this is coded, basically dark red is good, you're rich. Pink or light pink is bad. Now let me give you some numbers so you can situate yourself in terms of the variable differences. So a country like the US has an average GDP per capita of roughly about $50,000. Canada, it's about the same. Mexico is about 10,000. So right away, even in the sub-region like North America, you can see differences. Now, you do see the high end of the scale, which is 138,000. So there are some special administrative regions in China, for instance, or places in the Middle East where the average income is that high. But then you have places in Africa where, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where the GDP per capita is in the low hundreds. So a lot of variation, and this is just across space. Now, GDP per capita can be taken as a measure of development, but it's not the only one. And it certainly invites a lot of criticism. But one of the things I want to submit to you is the variable economic performance does have an impact on other aspects of human development. So this is another map taken from United Nations. What United Nations has done in addition to focusing on income is to develop a measure of human development. It's actually a measure that goes from 0 to 1, 0 being non-existence or very low levels of human development, 1 being the maximum. Now, if you were to look at the actual measure, you will find that the countries that get closer to 1 are going to be Scandinavian countries. And you won't be surprised that if you look at the data, the original data, most of the countries that score near 0 are going to be in Africa. Now, the way they present the data here is in terms of 4 groups. The very high human development group, which is the dark blue, and then you have intermediate levels, and then you have the low human development, green. And again, what I want to call your attention to here in this map is we see some of the same spatial differences we see in terms of GDP per capita are reflected here to varying degrees. We have a few exceptions. So for instance, Chile and Argentina have higher levels of human development than we would expect given their GDP per capita. But for the most part, what we do see here, and in fact, this is a two-way relationship, is that whether a country is rich or poor does have an impact systematic impact on the incidence of poverty and inequality, public health, education, and other developmental outcomes. So this is the big question. This is the big problem. Do we have any solutions? Well, it turns out that we do have a convention of wisdom. The convention of wisdom among both scholars and policymakers is that the answer has to do with institutions. And institutions here are to be understood as the rules of the game. But in particular, what scholars and policymakers emphasize are political institutions. That the political foundations of economic prosperity are to be found in formal political institutions like checks and balances, an independent judiciary, and also an emphasis on more abstract rule-based governance, where we have societies who are governed by abstract principles. This notion of the rule of law, that what matters is the existence of a public law that mediates how we interact in various domains. So, to a certain extent, the claim gets a lot of empirical support, but it's also problematic. It's problematic for two reasons. One is that when you apply these solutions, when you try to replicate formal institutions as we see them operate in advanced countries, they don't always work. To give you an example, in the early 19th century, when Latin America became independent from Spain, and you had the emergence of these various nation states, and it was time to write a constitution, almost invariably, they looked to the U.S. Constitution as a model. In fact, the constitutions were fairly identical, practically identical to the U.S. Constitution. 200 years later, we can see that those institutions didn't have the same impact they had in the U.S. So they don't always work. This is not to say that formal institutions don't work in developing countries, but they may work differently. And sometimes it seems that even the prescribed institutions may not be necessary to bring about economic development. Think about the case of China, where we don't have democratic institutions, but they have had phenomenal economic performance for several decades now. So this is the convention of wisdom. Now, why don't they work? Why don't formal institutions work in developing countries? Well, this is where we turn to the literature on international development. And one of the main findings or common themes that emerges in this literature is the notion or the claim that it's not really about formal institutions. It's about informal institutions. Informal arrangements in society that may not be codified in law, that may entail everyday interactions between members of society. These things make a difference. So they can have a high impact. And moreover, they're pervasive. You're going to find them everywhere. So this is where the action is. So the literature on international development, and I'm summarizing a great deal of work here, that's invited consideration of how informal institutions actually work. So far, so good. We know formal institutions don't work. The action is in the realm of informal institutions. But now we run into a big problem. The problem is we're not sure exactly what they are. We don't have a clear conceptual definition of informal institutions. And in fact, this particular project aims at bringing more clarity to the concept. But one of the things we do find when we look closely at the literature is that informal institutions are almost invariably embedded in some type of relation or network. It could be social interactions involving economic exchanges. It could be more durable social relations, political connections between family members, friends. A thing that comes up in the literature is that political connections are very important. Now, that shouldn't surprise us at all because political connections are important everywhere. But the claim here is that they tend to be more important in developing countries, and in particular because they lead to a higher tendency to rely on non-programmatic policies. So I need to explain what non-programmatic means. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute primer in political science to add a little bit of context here. So when we think of the contrast to be made here is between programmatic and non-programmatic policies. So programmatic policies are policies that have a specific program or they respond to a perceived societal need. Think about primary education. So policies are formulated in such a way that resources are allocated for a general purpose. And the rules tend to be for distribution are public, and we can actually verify that, in fact, the resources are distributed accordingly. So this is sort of the ideal way of doing public policy. You respond to societal needs, and you allocate resources for that purpose. There's another approach. That's the approach of non-programmatic policies. What's distinctive here is, of course, the negation of programmatic. So now policies are not formulated, and the resources are not dispersed according to some public criteria. So political connections are going to be important, or political conditions are going to be important. Now, policies could be distributed in one of two ways. They could have a partisan bias, that is, as a first filter, in terms of how the resources are going to be allocated, they could be allocated to groups. So the target could be groups by political parties, for instance, or they could be more, they could target individuals. And then the benefits that would occur would also be qualitatively different. So let me give you an example. So say the state assembly wants to pass a public policy here in the state of Indiana. And so one way to do it is to say, we're going to develop resources for higher education on programmatic, but using programmatic guidelines. So there'll be a general set of relatively abstract criteria. So if recipients qualify, satisfy the criteria, there'll be resources. But another way to do it would be to be non-programmatic. So an example of partisan bias would be, for instance, suppose there are two parties, the Hoosiers and the Boilermakers, and a politician could say, well, the way we're going to allocate resources for higher education is to favor one or the other. So we'll favor Hoosiers, for instance. And then the actual policies could be targeted at individuals. So it could be, for instance, that there could be non-conditional benefits, say tuition relief for IU students. But it's only accessible to IU students. Or it could be something that we associate with the term pork barrel politics. Maybe we'll give money to IU to build a new stadium or a new assembly hall. So that's the partisan approach, sort of a group-based approach. The one that is particularly interesting for development is this notion of clientelism, where policies are actually delivered directly to individuals. And for example, one possibility is patronage, which is when the public official offers a job to a friend, or the offer is conditioned on a political connection, political support. Elections are prime targets for clientelism, where a politician who wants to get elected would actually buy the vote or otherwise try to induce voters to show up on election day. Now, what's interesting about this, this is just an example of the various arguments that people advance in the literature. But one of the things, if you pay attention to the underlying language, you'll find that there are various types of networks at play here that could play a major role. The language itself tells you that some of these resources require political exchange, where a politician who has access to resources will allocate those resources on the basis of political conditions. And they could go to groups, they could go to individuals. So there's a lot of possibilities here. So it's now common to prescribe relational solutions. So previously I said that the mantra was institutions matter. Well, there's a second one, complementary one. It can be approached from either a positive or a negative orientation. The positive one will call for the creation of certain networks. Many of these arguments fall into the realm of social capital. So we create networks that enhance social capital. It could be a prescription for certain types of networks between public and private actors. It could solve some of these problems of human development. Sometimes the prescriptions are more negative. We recognize that there are networks that matter, but we want to get rid of them. Maybe the clientelism I just explained to you, or maybe there are corruption networks. We want to get rid of that. So the claim is that networks matter. And I find this not to be terribly informative. Why is it not informative? Well, one of the things that the claim doesn't address are two fundamental questions. One has to do with the fact that maybe networks do matter, but this is an empirical question. So we got to ask ourselves, where's the data? And the other one, which is equally important, is that we want to understand how they matter and why they matter. And in fact, these two questions invite a more general consideration of what it would take to build a network science of international development. So the problem of where to find the data, where to find empirical support for the general claim that networks matter, actually invites a broader question about which networks matter. As it turns out, there isn't just one single network. There are multiple networks. Even the people here in this room, we have a group of people, and We have multiple networks operating at the same time. Some of you are friends with each other, co-workers, relatives. We could actually go on and find multiple networks. So which of these networks would be the relevant one? For that, we need to have more theory. So and the state of the literature right now is that we do have early theories that are trying to understand how networks matter, but the stage is fairly incipient. We really don't have, there's a lot more work to be done in terms of specifying the mechanisms that will move from a particular network structure to a particular mechanism that actually generates the outcome of interest. So we need both more guidance in terms of empirical analysis as well as theoretical analysis. Of course, they can reinforce one another. So this is the challenge, I think. If we want to build a network science of international development, we got to tackle these two problems. Now, this is a highly interdisciplinary body of scholarly work. And those of you who do interdisciplinary work would know there are lots of challenges. I'll highlight two. The first one is the lack of a common descriptive framework. I noted that people tend to talk about relations and networks in various ways, but they all have their own definition of what they entail. And of course, there are differences about how to study, how to collect and analyze relational data. There's also theoretical confusion about the role of networks. How exactly do they work? And one that I really want to emphasize here is that there's very limited relational data. Despite the emphasis placed on networks and relations, we don't have a lot of data. Now, you could say, well, we could download it from the internet. We know that social media enables a lot of very important and interesting network science research. But here we run into another problem that relates to goes back to the big question. This is a map taken from the Oxford Internet Institute from fall 2013. And what it shows you, well, first of all, it's a distorted map. So let me explain the distortion. The distortion has to do with the size of the internet population in each of these countries. So it's not going to be a surprise to you that the largest population of internet users in the world is in China. So China appears bigger here than it would if it was just the underlying physical geography. You also have a few other developing countries like India and Brazil. But other than that, there are variable population sizes. So what we appreciate here is, first of all, an uneven distribution of the population of internet users. And in fact, there are areas where they're practically non-existent. So if we were to use the internet as a source for relational data, we're going to get most of our data from advanced countries. Now, that's the internet population. The second piece of information shown here, and this relates to the color coding, has to do with the penetration of internet in the country, how many people actually have access to the internet. And again, you see a lot of variation, but in those countries where we want to learn a great deal about international development, think about the African region, well, not only do we have smaller population sizes, but the access to the internet is very limited. So we're not going to get our data from the internet. It's going to be very hard to do. So we're going to have to get it from scratch. And the way we approach this is, what I'm going to emphasize in this talk is that this project is mostly about technology. There's also science that underlies the approach. But what I want to emphasize here is that ours is the first response to try to provide a foundation so people can actually do this. International development scholars can capture relational data and analyze it in a systematic way. And we have two guiding principles. The first one is we don't want to reinvent the wheel and say, we're network scientists, this is the way you have to think about the world. In fact, as I said before, if you look closely at the literature, people have a lot to say about networks. So we need to systematize, extract that existing knowledge to form the basis upon which we can build cumulative knowledge of the impact of networks. And the other thing we want to do, the second guiding principle, is we got to make it relatively easy. Network analysis can be rather complicated for a variety of reasons. And for that, we provide an ontological framework, the main purpose of which is to identify networks. And here we take a cue from the use of ontologies in the biological sciences. What biologists have done in some domains is that one of the reasons they've been able to accumulate knowledge is that they actually have very clear definitions, model organisms that people can refer to, they can collect data in the same model organism and build knowledge upon it. We want to do something similar. And I'm just going to show you one picture here of what we do. I'm going to let Markus say a little bit more about the computational linguistics. So we take, these are some sample books, material that we analyze, some articles, and basically the main exercise we're going to do is we're going to analyze the content of these works, and we're going to map it onto conceptual dictionary and ontology of networks. So we're actually going to define various types of networks, and that will help us classify what we already know. And beyond that, we have other extensions that I'll be happy to talk about in Q&A. But in the interest of time, I'm going to let Markus come and tell you a little bit about the computational linguistics. So I'm going to jump ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to say, I'll keep this fairly brief, just a few minutes on computational linguistics, just long enough to say the word, basically, and give you a little bit about what it is. And I'll just assume, I'm not going to assume much. I see a few students from one of my classes, so I'll assume they know a little bit about NLP. That's a little network embedded in here of my class. But in general, I'm going to assume very little. I'm just going to give you a sketch, a taste of this. But the idea is basically we have this problem of how can we go from text, so this is just the beginning of an abstract about bridging and bonding relationships in certain types of networks. How can we go from that to deriving ontological terms, things that are relevant for an ontology, things like self-organizing network or game-theoretic partner selection and so forth. So the idea is to basically extract meaning from text. And that's what computational linguistics aims to do. Another term for computational linguistics, more or less, is natural language processing, or NLP. And that's my field. So this is a nice sort of joint venture, and that's what I like to do on a daily basis. So we're going from the big question of social science at the beginning now to the very low-level details of words in a text. That's actually what we need to back up from that at some point and come back out to, can we derive things that are relevant for ontologies? So natural language processing, the goal of this field is to get computers to perform useful tasks involving human language, such as extracting information. So things like machine translation or question answering are typical applications. And one subfield is called information extraction, which is basically what this falls into. And the idea, what I just want to sketch now is some challenges this particular task has for extracting what we'll call structured information from unstructured data. So there are, when you have political science arguments, this is better than trawling the internet, in that people do, it's well-edited text, and they have section headings, but section headings differ from author to author. It may only be one part of it that's really about networks. For one paper, another paper, the entire thing is about defining a mathematical model. So in that sense, it's unstructured, maybe semi-structured data. So we can exploit some of that structure. But we really want to get out of it, okay, tell me that I have an individual-to-individual network that involves reciprocity, involves bonding relationships, that type of things. Note I'm using some of these terms without fully knowing what they mean. So I'm mimicking the computer in that sense. Bonding relationships, I'm just throwing out a phrase that was in the abstract. I'll just say a few things about the challenges and then just briefly show the beginning of our solutions. So challenges are, you have a diversity of data. So we have a wide range of topics like appellate courts or Turkic, Persian, and Slavic ethno-national divisions. So you get a wide diversity of vocabulary, which is going to be a bit of an issue. And then we need to spot words that are important, but they may not occur very often. So we don't really know that indebtedness may be something that you're really interested in looking at, but that could be very important in one paper. And it relates to the particular type of network. So that's a big issue which we face. That's a big issue for NLP in general when you have a diverse data. And then the other one I'll just mention right now is that you have context-dependent definitions of networks and properties. So in this case, one question that arises is the extent to which credit can be offered to the rural poor, etc. This may indicate a network, but only if that supply of credit is contingent upon personal relations. So what we need to know is more about the general context. Part of this is to say, that previous slide and this one, we can do some keyword spotting, like we can just look for words like network and relationship and link and so forth, but we need to dig a little deeper to get some of these things, and especially to know how certain things relate. I'll skip through that. We need to know the context, and we also need to know things about, you may have features that are spread far apart. So this mentions judicial citations containing an opinion. They're essentially a latent judgment about the case cited. etc. We use the complete network of citations and so forth. It's important to know that network of citations is of judicial citations, but you only know that from a previous sentence. So again, that kind of context is important, keeping track of kind of a global context. Now, the issue here is that NLP tools, they're good at giving us information from well-edited text, but they're usually good at a sentential level. So just within a single sentence, I can give you good information, but knowing which sentences are important for a document and which sentences, how sentences relate to one another is going to be important. And I'm not even really going to go into all of how we're going to handle that today. I'm just going to show you where it was starting with. So we have three components right now to our processing. I'm going to talk about mainly dependency parsing. I'll just show you a little bit to show you how this gives us useful information. To know what features are connected to a network, we can use something that's called dependency parsing. You can think about drawing grammar trees, if you remember that, if you ever had to do that like in 8th grade or something. That's dependency parsing in a sense, but automatically. So you don't have to do it. The computer will do it. I'm going to skip over that for now, even though this gets more into kind of the global features of a document. And then there is some keyword filtering where we use keywords to tell us what's important. So we've started by identifying a controlled set of vocabulary, network, system, actor, et cetera, some very common words. And we're using these to filter out linguistic information, which I'll show you linguistic information in a moment. So just this very simple thing. There's a sort of policy in my field of don't guess if you know, and don't do something complicated if you can do it simply. So at first, just take things that we know, we're confident are about networks. But the next step we're going to have to do is take these initial words and then look on a document-by-document basis and figure out which ones have similar patterns. So in one paper, we find the word network occurring with certain terms. Then we have this new paper, we don't find the word network, but we find those similar terms in similar types of patterns. Maybe that's also about a network. That's the type of idea I'm talking about bootstrapping with a small set of seeds and then extending that to things that are about terms that are relevant. Okay, parsers, I'll show this and just show what we extract from it, and then I'll be done. This, like I mentioned, is sort of like it is drawn a little bit differently, but it's a lot like what you did in grammar class. The risk hypothesis argues that actors seek bridging relationships. There's actually a couple minor errors in here, but even from this, we can see things that like there's a relationship between bridging and relationships. There's some connection over here. Do I have a pointer? There's some connection between bridging and relationships, and that actors are seeking these things out. We can start to determine relations between words, which start to tell us properties about networks and what types of networks are out there, which things go together. So just looking at, I think this paper was by Berardo and Schultz, if I remember correctly. We found out that a network, this was just through the abstract, so just a few set of sentences. Self-organizing policy network, actors were policy actors, popular actors, and then relationship partners were bonding, transitive, and reciprocal. So we're starting to determine these properties automatically. And we know it's not just the two words occur together in a sentence, it's that grammatically they go together. This one thing, an adjective modifies a noun. So transitive is describing the type of relationship. So we have more detailed information about what's a feature of what and who's doing what to whom. And I think that was, and we can get a few more details from that. Just want to mention the next step is to use document structure and other information within a paragraph to tell us what's relevant. And then, like I said, we went all the way from the big question in social science down to like what happens within a sentence in a document. And now we need to back up a little and say, okay, now over all the sentences in a document, what are the important terms that come out of that? What are the important relationships? And that's what we're currently working on. I can talk about that at some point. But yeah, we thank the FRSP program and then also the students, Won Lee, Luke Schimmick, and Dan Wyatt. And I guess we're here for questions. So. Or you can.
Half an hour is really tough, but you did it all.
Wait, we did it.
How many books are you going to use in this analysis?
So the question is about the size of the corpus. We have a working corpus of about 100 scholarly works. Thus far, we have annotated for training purposes about 30. We've just been working on this for a few months.
So Colin Allen and myself, we had one of those digging into data projects, and there we gained access to some of the HathiTrust book data, the Google Books data. That could be an interesting resource for you as well.
I'll just make one comment on that. So that would be a good resource. The one he mentioned kind of using the internet, and we could use like the HathiTrust collection. The cool thing is that then your techniques will have to vary a little bit because like these are well edited, assumedly well written scholarly works. And when you go to the internet, happy trust will probably vary, but probably also fairly well edited. But even the style of writing is different. How many verbs someone uses, how Latinized the words are, things like that will change over the documents.
All right. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.